Have you ever heard of a woman so desperate to survive that she chose a cage over freedom? Have you ever learned about someone who hid so long that the world forgot she was alive? She did not run away. She did not cross rivers at night. She did not disappear into the woods. Instead, she crawled into a space so small she could not stand. She could not stretch. She could barely breathe. And she stayed there for 7 years. Her name was Harriet Jacobs. And this is the story they never wanted anyone to hear. Harriet Jacobs was born in 1813 in Edenton, North Carolina, a small coastal town where the waters of the Albemarle Sound met streets lined with grand houses built on the backs of enslaved labor. For the first 6 years of her life, Harriet did not know she was enslaved. This fact is crucial to understanding her story. She did not know. Her parents loved her. Her father was a skilled carpenter, respected even by the white men who legally owned him. Her mother was gentle, kind, and did everything she could to shield her daughter from the reality of their condition. Harriet's grandmother, her mother's mother, was a woman of extraordinary strength. She had purchased her own freedom years before, and her small house became a sanctuary for the family. She baked crackers and sold them, earning her own money, owning her own space in a world that tried to deny her personhood. In those early years, Harriet learned to read. She learned to sew. These were small freedoms that felt like the world to a child who didn't yet understand what freedom actually meant. She played with other children. She laughed. She felt safe. But childhood for enslaved children was a borrowed thing, and the debt always came due. When Harriet was 6 years old, her mother died. The little girl stood at her mother's bedside, not fully understanding what death meant. She felt the silence that followed her mother's last breath. She felt like the world had tilted, and she couldn't find her balance. With her mother's death, Harriet's childhood ended. In the eyes of the law, she was not a child grieving her mother. She was property that needed a new owner. Her mother's mistress, a woman named Margaret Horniblow, had been relatively kind to them. When Margaret died, young Harriet was willed to her niece, Mary Matilda Norcom. And that is how, at 12 years old, Harriet Jacobs entered the household of Dr. James Norcom. In the book she would later write, Harriet called him Dr. Flint, to protect those still living and to shield herself from legal retaliation. But his real name was James Norcom, and he was a respected physician in Edenton, a pillar of the community, a church-going man, a slave owner who saw no contradiction between his Christian faith and his absolute power over human beings. He did not see Harriet as a child. He did not see her as human, that he saw her as property. As a body he believed he had the right to control, to use, to violate. And from the moment she entered his house, Harriet's real education began, not in reading or sewing, but in survival. That if you have never been enslaved, you cannot truly understand what it means to have no rights over your own body. Imagine waking every morning knowing that you exist only to serve, that your thoughts, your feelings, your desires mean nothing, that you can be sold at any moment, separated from everyone you love, sent anywhere your owner wishes. Now imagine being a girl, just entering adolescence, and realizing that your enslavement includes a particular kind of terror that enslaved men did not face in the same way. From the time Harriet was 13 or 14 years old, Dr. Norcom began to follow her with his eyes. At first, it was glances, then stares, then whispers. He would find her alone in the house and speak to her in ways that made her skin crawl. He told her she was his property, that she belonged to him, that she should be grateful for his attention. Harriet was a child. He was a man in his 50s, old enough to be her grandfather. His wife, Mary Matilda Horniblow Norcom, knew. How could she not? But her anger was never directed at him. It was directed at Harriet. This is what slavery did to everyone it touched. It corrupted even those who might have been allies. Mrs. Norcom saw Harriet not as a victim, but as a rival, as a threat to her marriage, as a temptation that her husband couldn't resist. She watched Harriet constantly. She questioned her. She made the young girl's life miserable with her jealousy and suspicion. But she never once confronted her husband, because, in that world, he had the power, and Harriet had none. Dr. Norcom's harassment escalated. He whispered obscene things to Harriet whenever they were alone. He told her that resistance was futile, that she would eventually submit, that she had no choice. He built a small cottage in the woods, not for her to live freely, but as a place where he could visit her away from his wife's prying eyes. A place where he could do whatever he wanted. With no witnesses, Harriet refused. Again and again she refused, but refusal for an enslaved girl was not simple. She could not run to the authorities. He was the authority. She could not tell his wife. She already blamed Harriet. She could not tell her grandmother. Though she was free, she was powerless against a white man of his standing. Every day was a negotiation for her dignity. Every day was a battle she was losing. Harriet told no one the full extent of what she endured, because enslaved girls were not believed. They were blamed. They were punished. They were silenced. The world told them that if something happened to them, it was their fault, that they must have invited it, that they must have wanted it, and so they learned to carry their pain alone. Harriet knew then that if she stayed, if she simply accepted what he intended, she would lose more than her freedom. She would lose herself. When you are drowning, you grab whatever is within reach, even if it's not solid ground, even if it's just another piece of driftwood that might keep you afloat a little longer. Harriet was drowning, and she made a choice that history would judge harshly, a choice that even she questioned. Even as she made it, there was a white lawyer in Edenton named Samuel Treadwell Sawyer. He was younger than Dr. Norcom, unmarried, and he showed Harriet a kindness she desperately needed. This was not a love story. This was not a romance. This was survival. Harriet chose to enter a relationship with Mr. Sawyer, not because she loved him, but because she believed it might protect her from Dr. Norcom. She believed that if she became pregnant by another man, Dr. Norcom would see her as spoiled and lose interest, that he would be disgusted and leave her alone. In 1829, Harriet gave birth to a son, Joseph. In 1833, she gave birth to a daughter, Louisa. She loved her children more than life itself. But their births did not bring her the protection she had hoped for. Instead, Dr. Norcom's rage intensified. He was not disgusted, he was enraged, humiliated. His pride was wounded, and he was determined to punish Harriet for defying him, that he threatened to sell her children, to send them to the plantation fields where they would work until their bodies broke, to separate them forever, just to teach her a lesson about who held the power. He told her he would build that cottage in the woods, and she would live there with her children isolated, where he could visit whenever he pleased and no one could stop him. Harriet realized then that there was no safety within the system of slavery. There were no good options. There were only degrees of horror. Her grandmother begged her to submit, not because she didn't love her, but because she was terrified of what would happen if Harriet continued to resist. The grandmother had seen enslaved women beaten, sold, destroyed for less. But Harriet couldn't do it. She couldn't surrender herself to him. She couldn't teach her children that submission was the price of survival, that she decided to escape. But here was the impossible problem. How do you escape when your children are still enslaved? When running north means abandoning them to a man who would punish them for your defiance. When the Fugitive Slave Act means even free states aren't truly safe. Harriet couldn't leave them behind. But she couldn't take them with her. And so she conceived a plan that seemed insane, a plan so desperate, so dangerous, that even now it's hard to believe she survived it. She would not run away. She would disappear. She would hide so close to home that Dr. Norcom would never think to look for her. She would let him believe she had fled north. And while he searched for her in distant cities, she would remain hidden, watching her children, waiting for the chance to truly escape. But where could she hide in a small town where everyone knew everyone, where enslaved people were constantly watched, where the penalty for harboring a fugitive was severe? Her grandmother had a house. And above that house was a crawl space, a garret so small, so uncomfortable, that no one would ever imagine a human being could survive there. That would be Harriet's refuge, her prison, her tomb, or her salvation. She didn't know which. The night Harriet disappeared, she walked out of Dr. Norcom's property as if she were running an errand. She went to a friend's house, a free black woman who risked everything to hide her for a few days. Then she was moved to another location. Then another. For weeks, she moved from hiding place to hiding place, staying one step ahead of the search parties. Dr. Norcom was convinced she had fled north. He traveled to New York and Boston, interrogating anyone who might have seen her. And while he searched, Harriet prepared to enter what would become her home for the next 7 years. Above her grandmother's house was a crawl space, a garret that was technically part of the roof structure. It was 9 feet long and 7 feet wide. At its highest point, the ceiling was only 3 feet high. At its lowest, Harriet could barely lift her head. There was no floor, only the joists and the rough boards laid across them. There were no windows, no door, no ventilation except for tiny cracks between the wooden planks. To enter, Harriet had to climb through a trapdoor and pull herself up into darkness. Her uncle made a few modifications to help her survive. He drilled a small hole in the wood, barely an inch across, so she could have a peephole to the outside world. He brought her a few blankets and a crude lamp that she could only use sparingly, for fear the light would be noticed. And then Harriet crawled inside, and the trapdoor closed behind her, and the world vanished. The space was so small that Harriet could not stand upright anywhere. She could not walk. She could barely crawl from one end to the other. She had to lie down or sit hunched over, her back bent, her neck strained. In summer, the heat was unbearable. The sun beat down on the roof, turning the crawl space into an oven. Harriet gasped for air through those tiny cracks, sweat pouring from her body, her skin burning, her head pounding. There was no relief, no culbris, no escape. In winter, the cold was equally brutal. The thin planks offered no insulation. Wind whistled through every crack. Harriet wrapped herself in every blanket she had, but she still shivered for hours, her teeth chattering, her body shaking. The darkness was complete except for that tiny peephole. She measured time by the thin beam of sunlight that sometimes filtered through, morning, noon, afternoon, evening. Rats lived in the crawl space with her. At night, they crawled over her body. Harriet learned not to scream, not to move suddenly, because any noise might alert someone below. Insects bit her constantly. Mosquitoes, fleas, beetles. She couldn't see them in the darkness, but she felt them. Her skin became covered in bites and sores. Her body began to break down. Her legs cramped from lack of movement. Her joints stiffened. She developed painful sores from lying in the same positions. But the worst pain, the absolute worst, was not physical. It was hearing her children's voices below her. That Harriet's grandmother's house was directly beneath her. Her children lived there, under Dr. Norcom's custody, but in their great-grandmother's care. And every day, Harriet could hear them. She could hear them playing. She could hear them laughing. She could hear them crying. She could hear them asking for her. "Where is Mama?" Joseph would ask. "When is Mama coming back?" "She's gone far away," their great-grandmother would say, her voice breaking. "But she loves you. She loves you so much." And Harriet would press her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out, to keep from calling down to them, to keep from revealing that she was right there, just feet away, unable to hold them. Her children thought she had abandoned them. They thought she had run away and left them behind. And Harriet let them believe it, because if they knew she was so close, they might accidentally reveal her hiding place. A child's innocent comment, "I wish Mama would come down from upstairs," could have gotten them all killed. So she stayed silent, and she let her children believe she didn't love them enough to stay. That was the price of survival. 7 years. That's 2,555 days. That's 61,320 hours. Every single one of those hours, Harriet Jacobs was in that space. Unable to stand, unable to walk, unable to see the sun except through a crack in the wood. 7 years of that does something profound to a person. Her grandmother brought her food every day, usually at night when it was safe. She would climb up quietly, open the trapdoor, and pass Harriet a plate of whatever she could spare. Bread, soup, vegetables from her garden. Harriet tried to eat, but the heat often made her nauseous. The darkness made her lose her appetite. She lost weight. Her body became thin and weak. Her uncle visited when he could. He was the one who maintained the small opening, who tried to improve her conditions in whatever tiny ways possible. But even his visits were rare and brief, too risky to do often. Harriet had to relieve herself in a chamber pot that her grandmother would empty for her. There was no privacy, no dignity. Every basic human function became a humiliation. She tried to exercise as much as she could in such a small space. She would stretch her arms, flex her legs, try to keep her muscles from atrophying completely. But there was only so much she could do. Her body deteriorated. Her legs became weak. Her back developed chronic pain that would plague her for the rest of her life. The isolation was maddening. Days blurred together. Weeks became indistinguishable. Harriet lost track of time. Sometimes she wasn't sure if she was awake or dreaming. She talked to herself. She prayed. She recited every poem and Bible verse she had ever memorized, just to keep her mind active. And she watched. Through that tiny peephole, she watched the world continue without her. She watched her children grow. Joseph becoming taller, stronger. Louisa learning to walk, then run, then help her great-grandmother with chores. She watched the seasons change. Spring blossoms, summer heat, autumn leaves, winter snow. She watched neighbors pass by. She watched Dr. Norcom walk past her grandmother's house, never suspecting she was right above him. Sometimes he would stop and question her grandmother. "Where is she? You must know where she's hiding. Tell me, and I'll be lenient with her children." And Harriet's grandmother would lie to his face. "I don't know. She's gone. She left us all." The courage that took, the risk she bore for her granddaughter, cannot be overstated. During those 7 years, something remarkable happened. Mr. Sawyer, the father of Harriet's children, was elected to Congress. Before he left for Washington, he negotiated to purchase the children from Dr. Norcom. This was part of their strategy, to get them out of Norcom's direct control, to give them a chance at eventual freedom. Norcom was so furious with Harriet, so determined to punish her through her children, that he agreed to the sale. He thought he was making her suffer by separating them permanently. He didn't know she was close enough to hear the entire negotiation. Mr. Sawyer didn't immediately free the children. He couldn't without raising suspicions. But he sent them to live with relatives in the North, where they would be educated and treated better than they ever could be in the South. The day Harriet's children left Edenton, she watched through her peephole as her grandmother said goodbye to them. She watched Joseph and Louisa climb into the carriage. She watched them disappear down the street. She didn't know if she would ever see them again, but she knew they were safer than they had been. And that knowledge, that tiny grain of hope, kept her alive. There were days when Harriet Jacobs wanted to die, not because she was weak, but because the suffering seemed endless. Because she couldn't see an end to the darkness. Because she wondered if this tiny crawl space would truly become her tomb. She thought about giving up, about revealing herself, about surrendering to Dr. Norcom and accepting whatever fate he had planned for her. At least then, she thought she could stand. She could walk. She could breathe fresh air. But then she would think about her children, about the life they might have if she could just hold on a little longer, about the message she would send them if she gave up, and she would find the strength to survive one more day. The psychological toll of that confinement is impossible to fully describe. The isolation, the sensory deprivation, the constant fear of discovery. Every sound made her heart race. Every footstep on the stairs below made her freeze in terror. Every conversation she overheard made her wonder if someone suspected where she was hiding. Harriet developed rituals to keep herself sane. She counted the boards in her prison. She named the rats that visited her. She created elaborate stories in her mind about the people she watched through her peephole, imagining their lives, their conversations, their thoughts. Sometimes she wrote. Her grandmother managed to smuggle paper and a pen to her, and Harriet wrote letters, letters she could never send, letters that were just for her, letters to her children, letters to her mother, long dead, letters to God, asking why this was her life. She also experienced something unexpected. She found a kind of power in her invisibility. Dr. Norcom thought he had won. He thought Harriet had escaped his grasp by fleeing north. He thought he had lost her forever, but she was still there, still watching, still defying him in the most profound way, by denying him the satisfaction of knowing where she was. Every day she stayed hidden was a day she proved that he did not have total control. That even in the most desperate circumstances, she could still choose resistance. That knowledge sustained her when nothing else could. While Harriet was hidden in that crawl space, the world kept turning. Through the cracks in the wood, through whispered conversations she overheard, through rare newspapers her uncle would share with her, she learned about what was happening beyond her tiny prison. The abolitionist movement was growing stronger in the North. People like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth were speaking out against slavery with increasing boldness. But in the South, the institution of slavery was becoming more entrenched. Laws were passed, making it even harder for enslaved people to escape. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it legal for slave catchers to operate in free states, kidnapping black people and dragging them south. Harriet learned that some enslaved people were using T.H. Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses and allies who helped runaways reach Canada. She dreamed of joining them, but she was trapped. She also heard stories of enslaved people who had tried to escape and been caught. The punishments were horrific: whippings, brandings, mutilations. Some were sold to the Deep South, to the cotton and sugar plantations, where conditions were even worse than in North Carolina. Every story reminded her of what was at stake. Every tale of recapture made her more cautious, but every story of successful escape gave her hope. Through her peephole, Harriet also watched her community. She saw free black people navigating the impossible tension of living in a slave society. She saw them helping each other, protecting each other, surviving. She saw white people too, some who were comfortable with slavery, some who seemed uncomfortable but did nothing about it, and a rare few who quietly helped enslave people when they could. Harriet learned that the world was not simply divided into good people and evil people. It was more complicated than that. Most people, she realized, were just trying to survive in a system that was bigger than any individual. But that didn't excuse their complicity, and it didn't make her suffering any less real. There were moments when Harriet nearly got caught. Once, during a particularly hot summer, she became so desperate for air that she shifted position too quickly. One of the boards beneath her creaked loudly. She froze, held her breath, waited. Below her, she heard her grandmother pause in her work. "What was that?" someone asked. "Just the house settling," her grandmother said calmly. "Old wood does that in the heat." But Harriet saw her face through a crack in the floor. She was terrified. Another time, Harriet had a coughing fit. It came on suddenly, probably from the dust and poor air quality, and she couldn't stop. She pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to muffle the sound, but she couldn't breathe. Her uncle rushed up to the attic space and gave her water. "You have to be quiet," he whispered urgently. "Dr. Norcom was just here. He's still suspicious." Harriet nodded, gasping, tears streaming down her face. There was also a night when a terrible storm hit Edenton. The wind was so strong that parts of the roof began to tear away. Rain poured through the cracks, soaking Harriet completely. She was certain the entire roof would collapse, and she would be discovered. But her uncle and some trusted friends managed to repair the damage before morning. They worked in the darkness, in the rain, risking everything to keep her hidden. Every close call reminded Harriet how precarious her situation was. How many people were putting themselves in danger for her. How one wrong move could destroy them all. The fear was exhausting. But so was the gratitude. In 1842, after 7 years in that crawl space, Harriet Jacobs finally emerged. Her uncle determined that the search for her had died down enough that she might be able to escape north. Mr. Sawyer, now a congressman, had arranged for her children to be sent to relatives in New York. It was time for Harriet to try to reach them, but she almost didn't make it. When she first tried to stand after climbing out of that space, her legs collapsed beneath her. 7 years of limited movement had weakened her severely. She couldn't walk properly. Every joint ached. Her back was permanently damaged. Her grandmother and uncle had to help her relearn how to move, how to walk, how to function as a person again. She was also thin, dangerously so. Her skin was pale from lack of sunlight. Her eyes struggled to adjust to normal light after so much darkness. But she was alive, and she was determined to reach freedom. Friends arranged for Harriet to travel by boat. She was hidden in a small compartment, much like the space she had just left. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent 7 years in a crawl space, and now she was traveling to freedom in yet another confined space. But this time, she was moving. This time, she was getting closer to her children. The journey north was terrifying. At any moment, they could have been stopped. She could have been discovered. She could have been dragged back to North Carolina in chains. But they made it. Harriet arrived in Philadelphia, then made her way to New York. And there, finally, she was reunited with her children. Joseph was no longer the little boy she remembered. He was nearly a teenager now. Louisa was a young girl, smart and curious. They barely remembered her. 7 years is a lifetime to a child. Harriet held them and sobbed. She tried to explain where she had been, why she had left them, why she had stayed silent for so long. They didn't understand. Not really. How could they? But they were alive. They were with her. And that was everything. Here's the bitter truth. Even in the North, Harriet Jacobs was not free. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that she was still legally enslaved. Dr. Norcom had died, but his daughter, Mary Matilda, the girl to whom Harriet had been willed, inherited her as property. She and her husband, Daniel Messmore, were determined to reclaim their investment. Slave catchers were everywhere in New York. Free black people were being kidnapped off the streets and sold south. Even freeborn black people weren't safe. Many were falsely claimed as runaways and dragged away before they could prove their status. Harriet lived in constant fear. She moved frequently. She used different names. She worked as a nursemaid and domestic servant, trying to blend in and stay invisible. She found work with a magazine editor named Nathaniel Parker Willis and his wife, Mary Stace Willis. They were kind to her, but they also knew her situation. They knew she was a fugitive. In 1850, the situation became even more dangerous when the new, stricter Fugitive Slave Act was passed. It required citizens to assist in capturing runaways. It denied suspected fugitives the right to a jury trial. It made the entire North complicit in slavery. In 1852, Mary Matilda Messmore and her husband came to New York, determined to capture Harriet and take her back. Harriet was terrified. After everything she had endured, 7 years in a crawl space, years of running, she was about to lose it all. But something remarkable happened. Cornelia Grinnell Willis, the second wife of Nathaniel Parker Willis, decided to act. Without asking Harriet, without even telling her what she was doing, she contacted the Messmores and negotiated to purchase her freedom. She paid them $300,300. That's what Harriet's freedom cost. That's what she was worth to them. When Mrs. Willis told Harriet what she had done, the formerly enslaved woman felt a storm of emotions. She was grateful, deeply, profoundly grateful. This woman had risked her own money to save her. But Harriet was also furious, because freedom is not supposed to be something you purchase. Freedom is not supposed to be a commodity. She should never have needed to be bought, but that was the reality of slavery. Even after escaping, even after years of suffering, she was still considered property under the law. Now, finally, legally, officially, Harriet Jacobs was free. But the scars of slavery would never leave her. For years after gaining her freedom, Harriet lived quietly. She worked. She cared for her children. She tried to build a normal life. But she couldn't stop thinking about all the women who were still enslaved, all the girls who were enduring what she had endured, all the stories that were being buried in silence. The abolitionist movement was growing, but most of the published narratives were written by men. Frederick Douglass's autobiography had been published in 1845 and was widely read. Other male former slaves were sharing their stories. But women's stories, especially the sexual violence and harassment they endured, were not being told. People didn't want to hear them. They were too uncomfortable, too scandalous, too intimate. But Harriet knew that if women didn't tell the truth, the whole truth, the world would never understand what slavery really was. So she decided to write her story. She began working on her narrative in the mid-1850s. She wrote in the evenings after her work was done. She wrote in secret, afraid of how people would react. Harriet was not a professional writer. She was a woman who had taught herself to read and write in a system designed to keep her illiterate. Her education was fragmented, stolen in moments between chores. But she had something more important than formal education. She had the truth. She wrote about Dr. Norcom's harassment, about the impossible choices enslaved women faced, about the 7 years she spent in that crawl space, about the psychological and physical torture of slavery. She also wrote about the complicity of white women like Mrs. Norcom, who turned their anger on enslaved girls instead of on their own husbands, about the hypocrisy of Christian slaveholders who claimed to follow Jesus while denying the humanity of their slaves. Harriet wrote under a pseudonym at first, Linda Brent, to protect herself and others. She changed names. She altered small details. But the story was true. Finding a publisher was difficult. Many rejected her manuscript. Some said it was too controversial. Others said no one would believe that a black woman could write so eloquently. Finally, in 1861, her narrative was published, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself. That last part, written by herself, was crucial. Harriet insisted on it, because people often assumed that black authors had white editors or ghostwriters. She wanted there to be no doubt that these were her words, her story, her truth. The book was published just as the Civil War was beginning. In some ways, the timing was perfect. The nation was finally being forced to confront the reality of slavery. In other ways, it was terrible. The book got lost in the chaos of war. But it was out there. Harriet's story was told, and she refused to be ashamed of it. Not everyone praised Harriet's book. Some people, even abolitionists, criticized her for the choices she had made. They said she should not have entered a relationship with Mr. Sawyer. They said she should have remained pure, no matter what. They said her story would hurt the abolitionist cause by confirming racist stereotypes about black women's sexuality. Harriet expected this judgment. She had lived with it her entire life. But she refused to accept their shame. She did not apologize for surviving. She did not apologize for making impossible choices in an impossible situation. The people who judged her had never been enslaved. They had never faced a choice between submitting to a man they despised or seeking protection from another. They had never had to decide whether to abandon their children or to hide in a crawl space for 7 years. They did not have the right to judge her. That I end her narrative. Harriet wrote directly to her critics. She acknowledged that she had made choices that others might consider immoral. But she explained the context. She explained the impossible situation she faced, and she asked them to consider, what would you have done? It's easy to say what you would do when you've never faced that choice. It's easy to claim you would have acted differently when your freedom, your dignity, your very humanity have never been at stake. Slavery did not just steal labor. It stole choices. It forced people into situations where there were no good options, only degrees of harm. And then it blamed them for the choices they made to survive. This is what Harriet wanted people to understand. This is why she wrote her story. Not to seek pity, not to be seen merely as a victim, but to show the world what slavery really was, and how it corrupted everything it touched. After her book was published, Harriet continued to work and to advocate for formerly enslaved people. During the Civil War, she raised money for black refugees. She collected clothing and supplies for contraband camps, places where enslaved people who had escaped to Union lines were living in terrible conditions. She worked with organizations trying to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. She understood better than most what that transition required. Not just legal freedom, but education, resources, support. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. The 13th Amendment followed in 1865, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. Slavery was over, legally at least. But Harriet knew that the end of slavery did not mean the end of racism, did not mean the end of discrimination, did not mean true equality. After the war, Harriet traveled to Savannah, Georgia, and opened a school for formerly enslaved children. She taught them to read and write. She taught them their history. She taught them that they were valuable, worthy, human. Many of these children had been born into slavery. They had been told their entire lives that they were inferior, that they were meant to serve. Harriet wanted them to know differently. She also continued to write and speak, though less publicly than some other abolitionists. She was older now, and her health had never fully recovered from those 7 years in the attic. Her back caused her constant pain. She struggled with respiratory issues from breathing poor air for so long. She tired easily, but she kept working. Because the work was not done, her children grew up. Joseph became a successful activist and printer. Louisa married and had children of her own. Harriet became a grandmother. She lived to see her grandchildren born free, truly free, not purchased, not manumitted, but born into a world where slavery was illegal, that IT was a joy she never thought she would experience. But even in freedom, the memories never left her. The nightmares never stopped. She would wake up in the night, feeling like she was back in that crawl space, unable to breathe, unable to move. The trauma of those 7 years, of her entire experience of slavery, stayed with her until her last breath. Harriet's narrative was one of the first to explicitly discuss the sexual violence that enslaved women endured. This was not an easy thing to write about. In the Victorian era, women were not supposed to discuss such topics. Sexual purity was considered a woman's most valuable quality. But Harriet knew that if she stayed silent about this aspect of slavery, she would be complicit in the lie that slavery was only about labor and economics. Slavery was also about sexual exploitation, about the absolute power that white men held over black women's bodies, about the children born from rape who were then enslaved by their own fathers. Enslaved women had no legal protection. They could not say no. They could not report their abusers. They had no recourse, and when they were violated, society blamed them. White women blamed them for tempting their husbands. White men blamed them for being immoral. Even some black people internalized these messages and judged women like Harriet for not somehow maintaining their virtue, in a system designed to destroy it. Harriet wrote her narrative to say, "This is not our shame. This is the shame of slavery itself." She wrote about how Mrs. Norcom, who should have been her ally, who should have protected her, instead became her tormentor because she blamed Harriet for her husband's actions. She wrote about how the law offered her no protection because she was considered property, not a person. She wrote about how she made choices that others judged, but which were the only choices available to her. And she wrote to other women, enslaved and free, to say, "You are not alone. You are not to blame. You survived, and that is enough." People who have never experienced slavery often have a simplified understanding of what it was. They imagine plantations and cotton fields. They imagine whips and chains. They imagine physical brutality. And yes, all of that was real. All of that was horrific. But slavery was also psychological warfare. It was the systematic destruction of families. It was the denial of education, of hope, of any sense of future. Slavery was being told every day that you were less than human, that you were property, that you had no rights, no dignity, no worth beyond your labor. Slavery was watching your children be sold away from you, knowing you would never see them again. Slavery was being forced to smile and act grateful while your enslavers abused you. Slavery was having no legal recourse when you were raped, beaten, or tortured. Slavery was living in constant fear, fear of punishment, fear of separation, fear of death. And for women, slavery often meant an additional layer of horror, sexual exploitation that could begin when they were children and continue until they were too old to be considered desirable. Enslaved women were wet nurses for white babies while their own children starved. They were forced to bear children who would be enslaved like them. They were sold for their breeding potential. They were raped and then blamed for the rape. This is what Harriet wanted people to understand when she wrote her narrative. Slavery was not just a labor system. It was a system of total domination that affected every aspect of life: physical, psychological, sexual, emotional, spiritual. And it corrupted everyone it touched, not just the enslaved, but the enslavers too. Harriet saw how slavery corrupted Dr. Norcom, how it convinced him that his desires were more important than her humanity. how it gave him permission to abuse her and face no consequences. She saw how slavery corrupted Mrs. Norcom, how it turned her into a cruel woman who blamed the victim instead of the perpetrator. She saw how slavery corrupted the entire community of Edenton, how otherwise decent people participated in an evil system because it benefited them economically. Slavery was evil, not just because it was cruel, but because it twisted the souls of everyone involved. The cost of survival for Harriet Jacobs was immense, not just during slavery, but for the rest of her life. Those 7 years in the crawl space destroyed her health. Her back was permanently damaged. She had chronic pain that never went away. Her lungs were weakened from breathing poor air. Her legs were never quite right. But the physical damage was only part of it. The psychological impact was even more profound. She struggled with what we might now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. She had nightmares. She had panic attacks. She struggled with depression. She couldn't bear small, enclosed spaces. Even after gaining freedom, she couldn't sleep in a room with the door closed. She needed to know she could leave. She needed to know she wasn't trapped. She also struggled with trust. After years of having to hide, having to lie, having to be constantly vigilant, it was hard to let people in. It was hard to believe she was truly safe. And she struggled with the memories. They would come unbidden, triggered by a smell, a sound, a sensation. Suddenly she would be back in that crawl space, unable to breathe, unable to move. This is what survival required. This is what it cost. But Harriet survived. And that matters. She survived when so many others didn't. She lived to see her children free. She lived to tell her story. She lived to see slavery abolished. Was it worth it? That's not really the right question. She did what she had to do to survive. There was no other choice. And she refused to apologize for surviving. Freedom, Harriet learned, was not a simple thing. She thought that once she escaped slavery, once she reached the North, once she was legally free, everything would be better. But freedom in a racist society is complicated. She was free, yes. But she was still a black woman in America. She still faced discrimination. She still faced prejudice. She still had limited opportunities. She was free, but she was poor. Freedom didn't come with resources. It didn't come with land or education or economic opportunity. She was free, but she was traumatized. Freedom didn't erase the memories. It didn't heal the wounds. She was free, but she was still angry. Angry at the system that had enslaved her. Angry at the people who had harmed her. Angry at a society that was so slow to change. Real freedom, the kind of freedom Harriet dreamed of, would have meant more than just the absence of legal slavery. It would have meant equality. It would have meant justice. It would have meant reparations for what had been stolen from her people. It would have meant a society that acknowledged what had been done and worked to make it right. They didn't get that kind of freedom. What formerly enslaved people got was a partial freedom, better than slavery, certainly, but far from true equality. Still, Harriet was grateful for what she had. She had survived. She had her children. She had the ability to tell her story. And she had hope that future generations would have more than she did. Hope that the world would continue to change. Hope that her story would help people understand what slavery really was and why it could never be allowed to happen again. People sometimes wondered why Harriet was willing to share such painful, intimate details of her life. Why expose herself to judgment? Why relive the trauma? Why not just try to forget and move on? Harriet wrote her story because silence protects the oppressor, never the oppressed. She wrote because she knew there were thousands of women who had experienced what she experienced, but whose stories would never be told. Women who died in slavery. Women who never learned to read and write. Women who were too afraid to speak. She wrote for them. She wrote because the abolitionist movement was telling only part of the story. They talked about the economic evils of slavery. They talked about the physical brutality. But they were uncomfortable talking about sexual violence. Harriet wrote to force people to confront the full reality of what slavery was. She wrote because she wanted her children to understand why she made the choices she made. Why she hid for 7 years. Why she couldn't just run away. why she did things that others might judge as immoral. She wrote so they would know that she loved them more than her own life. She wrote because she believed in the power of truth. She believed that if people truly understood what slavery was, not the sanitized version, but the real, brutal, complicated truth, they would demand change. She also wrote because she was angry. Angry at a system that had tried to destroy her. Angry at people who thought they had the right to own other human beings. Angry at a society that blamed victims and protected abusers. Her book was an act of defiance. It was her saying, "You tried to silence me. You tried to erase me. You tried to reduce me to property. But I am still here. I am still speaking. And you cannot stop me." If there are lessons to be learned from Harriet Jacobs' life, they are these. First, survival is not weakness. Harriet survived by any means necessary, and she refused to be ashamed of that. Second, silence protects abusers. Speaking the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's painful, is the only way to create change. Third, systems of oppression corrupt everyone they touch, not just the oppressed, but the oppressors too. Slavery harmed everyone in different ways. Fourth, freedom is not simple. It's not just the absence of chains. True freedom requires equality, justice, opportunity, and healing. Fifth, we must tell our stories, especially the stories that make people uncomfortable. Because those are the stories that challenge the status quo. Those are the stories that create change. Sixth, women's experiences matter. For too long, history was written by men and about men. But women's stories, especially the stories of women who survived violence and oppression, are crucial to understanding the past. Seventh, survival sometimes requires making impossible choices. And we should not judge people for the choices they make when they have no good options. Eighth, healing takes time. The trauma of slavery did not end when slavery ended. The effects lasted for generations, and in some ways, they still last today. Ninth, hope is a form of resistance. Even in the darkest times, even when Harriet was trapped in that crawl space thinking she might die there, she held onto hope. And that hope kept her alive. Finally, we are more than what was done to us. Harriet was enslaved. She was abused. She was hunted. But she was also a mother, a writer, an activist, a survivor. Her life was more than her trauma. Harriet Jacobs lived a long life, longer than many formerly enslaved people did. She lived until 1897. She was 84 years old when she died to be why then, slavery had been abolished for more than 30 years. Her children were free. Her grandchildren were free. The world she died in was vastly different from the world she was born into. But racism had not ended. Discrimination had not ended. Violence against black people had not ended. The end of slavery was not the end of the struggle. After the brief period of Reconstruction, when black people gained some political power and rights, came the backlash. Jim Crow laws, segregation, lynching, the systematic disenfranchisement of black voters that in many ways, the promise of freedom was betrayed. Harriet saw this happening, and it broke her heart. They had fought so hard for freedom, and now it was being taken away piece by piece. But she also saw resilience. She saw black communities building their own institutions. She saw families reuniting after being separated by slavery. She saw children learning to read and write, something that had been illegal during slavery. She saw progress, even if it was slower then. She saw progress, even if it was slower than she had hoped. In her final years, Harriet lived quietly in Washington, D.C., with her daughter Louisa. She was in poor health. Her body, broken by those 7 years in the crawl space, never fully recovered. But she was surrounded by family. She had lived to see her grandchildren grow up. She had lived to tell her story. When she died on March 7, 1897, she was buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, not far from where her narrative had been published decades earlier. Her death was not widely noted. She was not famous. Most people had forgotten about incidents in the life of a slave girl. But her story survived. And eventually it would be rediscovered. For many years after Harriet's death, her book was largely forgotten. Some scholars questioned whether it was even real. They thought it might have been written by white abolitionists and falsely attributed to her. They couldn't believe that an enslaved woman could write so eloquently. This erasure was its own kind of violence. Even in death, even after sharing her story, Harriet was not believed. But in the 20th century, scholar Jean Fagan Yellen did extensive research and proved definitively that Harriet had written her own narrative. She found letters, documents, and evidence that confirmed every detail Harriet had written. The book was republished. It began to be taught in schools and universities. Scholars recognized it as one of the most important slave narratives ever written, and specifically, as one of the few that centered women's experiences. Today, Harriet's story is taught alongside Frederick Douglass's narrative as essential reading for understanding slavery. Her legacy is this: she showed the world that slavery was not just about labor. It was about sexual exploitation. It was about the impossible choices women faced. It was about survival in the face of total domination. She showed that enslaved women were not passive victims. They were strategic. They resisted in whatever ways they could. They made choices, sometimes difficult, controversial choices, to survive and protect their children. She showed that silence about sexual violence only protects abusers. That speaking the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, is necessary. She showed that freedom is complicated. That the end of slavery was only the beginning of the struggle for equality. And she showed that our stories matter. That formerly enslaved people, especially women, deserve to tell their own stories in their own words. You might wonder why Harriet's story still matters. Slavery ended more than 150 years ago. Why should people today care about what she experienced? Here's why. First, the effects of slavery did not end when slavery ended. The trauma, the poverty, the discrimination, all of that was passed down through generations. The wealth stolen from enslaved people was never returned. The families separated were never fully reunited. The education denied was never made up. These effects ripple through time. They shape the world we live in today. Second, the same patterns of oppression continue in different forms. Sexual exploitation of vulnerable people still happens. Human trafficking still exists. Women and girls are still abused and then blamed for their abuse. The powerful still silence the vulnerable. Victims are still not believed. Survivors are still judged for the choices they make to stay alive. Harriet's story is not just history. It's a warning about what happens when society allows some people to have absolute power over others. Third, we still struggle with telling the full truth about difficult topics. People still want to sanitize history. They want to teach about slavery without talking about sexual violence. They want to focus on inspiring stories of resistance without acknowledging the trauma and horror. But whitewashing history doesn't protect anyone. It only ensures that we don't learn the lessons we need to learn. Fourth, the fight for equality is not over. Yes, slavery is illegal, but racism persists. Discrimination persists. Violence against black people persists. Harriet's story reminds us that legal freedom was only the first step. True equality requires ongoing work. Finally, stories like Harriet's remind us of human resilience. She survived 7 years in a crawl space. She survived losing her children. She survived trauma that should have destroyed her. And she lived. She told her story. She fought for freedom and justice. If she could survive that, if she could find hope in the darkness, then others facing oppression today can too. Her story is proof that even in the worst circumstances, the human spirit can endure. Harriet Jacobs did not survive because she was exceptionally strong. She survived because she had no other choice. And if her story makes you uncomfortable, it should. Because history is not just about the past. It is about what happens when power goes unchecked, when women are silenced, and when survival is mistaken for shame. Harriet was judged for the choices she made to stay alive. But those who judged her never had to make those choices. They never had to choose between protecting their children and preserving their own dignity. They never had to hide in a crawl space for 7 years. They never had to watch their children grow up from behind a crack in the wood, unable to reveal themselves. They never had to survive a system designed to break them completely. So Harriet would not apologize. Not for surviving. Not for the choices she made. Not for telling the truth. Harriet Jacobs was born enslaved in 1813. She hid for 7 years to escape a man who believed he owned her. She gained her freedom in 1852. She published her story in 1859. She lived until 1897. She was a survivor. She was a mother. She was a writer. She was a witness to one of the greatest evils in human history. And she is still here, not in body, but in the story she left behind. We must remember her. We must remember all the enslaved women whose stories were never told. We must remember what slavery really was, not the sanitized version, but the full, brutal, complicated truth that we must remember that silence protects oppressors, that speaking the truth is an act of resistance, that survival is not weakness. We must remember that freedom is not simple, that the fight for equality is ongoing, that the past shapes the present. And we must remember that even in the darkest places, even when hope seems impossible, the human spirit can endure. Harriet Jacobs hid for 7 years so the world could one day see the truth. Now we must ask ourselves, what will we do with that truth? Will we turn away because it's uncomfortable? Or will we face it, learn from it, and work to ensure that such evil never happens again? The choice is ours. But we must know this. Silence is also a choice. And silence has consequences. Harriet's story is not just about the past. It's about now. It's about the future. It's about what kind of world we want to create. She did her part. She survived. She spoke. She told the truth. Now it's our turn to honor her memory by continuing the work she started, by fighting for justice, by amplifying silence voices, by ensuring that the most vulnerable among us are protected and heard. The story of Harriet Jacobs is one of unimaginable suffering and extraordinary courage. That IT is the story of a woman who refused to be broken, even when the entire system of slavery was designed to break her. It is the story of a mother's love so fierce that she would sacrifice 7 years of her life, her health. It is the story of resistance in its most creative and desperate form, hiding in plain sight, denying her oppressor the satisfaction of knowing where she was. And it is the story of truth-telling as an act of liberation, speaking the uncomfortable realities that society wanted to ignore. Harriet Jacobs' life stands as a haunting reminder that slavery was not only about forced labor, but about control, abuse, silence, and survival. Her story exposes the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, a truth many tried to deny. Her narrative remains one of the most powerful first-hand accounts of slavery written by a woman, and it continues to teach us about courage, resilience, and the cost of freedom. If this story moved you, share it, because stories buried in silence are the ones most likely to repeat. Subscribe for more forgotten histories, women who survived power, and truths history tried to erase. These stories need to be told. These voices need to be heard. Because when we forget history, we risk repeating it. And the price of forgetting is always paid by the most vulnerable. Remember Harriet Jacobs. Remember her courage. Remember her truth. And make sure her sacrifice was not in vain. Let her story inspire us to fight against all forms of oppression, to believe survivors, to challenge systems of power that exploit the vulnerable, and to never, ever stay silent in the face of injustice. Harriet Jacobs spent 7 years in silence to protect her children and preserve her dignity. Now it's our responsibility to break the silence, to tell her story, to honor her memory, and to continue the fight for true freedom and equality that she began.